I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am the newly appointed co-director of the Wade Center. And I feel honored to be able to invite you, to welcome you to the 4th annual Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship, which was named in honor of a former Board of Trustee member here at Wheaton College, Ken Hansen, and his wife, Jean. The first 2 years, collected lectures have been published in these books, which will be for sale after the lectures are finished at a discount to you. The first year, Dr. Philip Ryken was talking about Tolkien, and we just got his book that's been translated into Portuguese. So that's exciting. And the second year, we have this beautifully produced book on George MacDonald by Dr. Tim Larson. Tim, where are you? He will be signing books after the lectureship tonight in the museum, and once again, you can purchase these books at a discount at our bookstore. We need to acknowledge for the production of these beautiful volumes, InterVarsity Press, which partnered with the Wade in order to produce them. And I am delighted to be able to introduce you to the editor that has worked with us, Dr. David McNutt. He has a PhD in theology from Cambridge, and so he brings theological acumen and critical insight to his role as editor of these volumes. And he has a few words to say to us tonight before we get started. Please welcome Dr. McNutt.
Thank you very much, Crystal. I promise I'll keep this commercial brief. It's my pleasure to bring greetings and appreciation from IVP Academic and Imprint of InterVarsity Press. We've been publishing thoughtful Christian resources since 1947, and many of those are related to Wheaton College. Some of you will know either by reputation or by memory, the likes of Art Holmes and Clyde Kilby and others who we have published, and that tradition continues with the Hansen Lectureship in publishing these fantastic resources. It is both a professional and personal pleasure to be able to work with the likes of Dr. Ryken and Tim and Christine Cologne, whose volume on Dorothy Sayers we're looking forward to publishing next year, and Jerry Root, who I'm looking forward to hearing this evening. To be able to do that is a great pleasure and joy as an editor. It's not often that you hear from the editor publicly about the books, so I just want to take the chance to say thank you to the Wade Center for this partnership, to the faculty members who have brought their insights and imagination to their study of the Wade authors, and we look forward to continuing this partnership. So please do have a look at the books afterwards, pick up 10, 20, 30, and be sure to have Tim sign that for you. So thank you all very much.
Before my co-director of the Wade Center, who it's quite convenient, I happen to be married to, before he introduces the Ken and Jean Hansen speakers, it seems only fitting for us to welcome the son of Ken and Jean Hansen, Dr. Walter Hansen, who has been involved with and supportive of the Wade since its inception. He serves on the advisory board, and it has been a delight for David and I to get to know him. He himself is a superb scholar, and he will begin our lectures tonight by giving us a reading and then opening in prayer. Dr. Hansen.
One of the great gifts of these times is to be with friends, and Jerry is one of those very special friends in my life. And of course, that was one of the themes of these authors as well, friendship, love. And I read from C.S. Lewis' Four Loves, his chapter on friendship. In a perfect friendship, appreciative love is, I think, often so great and so firmly based that each member of the circle feels in his secret heart humbled before all the rest. Sometimes he wonders what he is doing there among his betters. He is lucky beyond desert to be in such company, especially when the whole group is together, each bringing out all that is best, wisest, or funniest in all the others. Those are the golden sessions, when 4 or 5 of us, after a hard day's walking, have come to our inn, when our slippers are on, our feet are spread out toward the blaze, and our drinks at our elbows, when the whole world and something beyond the world opens itself to our minds as we talk, and no one has claim on or any responsibility for the other, but all are free men and equals as if we had first met an hour ago, while at the same time an affection mellowed by the years enfolds us. Life, natural life, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it? And I'm grateful for that friendship with Jerry and others of you in this room. That's a gift from God. And we thank you, God, the origin of all friendship, that you sent your Son to be our friend, our Redeemer, and to dwell among us here this evening as we put on our slippers, stretch out our feet toward the fire, have drinks at our elbows, we wish, and enjoy a wonderful time of deeply enriching thought. We thank you for Jerry, for Jeff. Fill them with your Spirit as they teach us and guide us tonight. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Walter. And now David will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Good evening. I do feel this is one of those golden sessions. We were talking this afternoon about the mission of the Wade and appropriate programming. And when I look around and see all these scintillating intellects and tender hearts and well-seasoned souls, I feel that we must be doing something right. Dr. Jerry Root is professor of evangelism and the director of the Wheaton Evangelism Initiative at the Billy Graham Center for Evangelism. And if you heard the word evangelism 3 times, that speaks to where Jerry's heart is. Jerry earned varsity letters in football and wrestling at Whittier College in Southern California. He prides himself in the fact that he never fumbled the ball and he never lost yardage. And since he's been at Wheaton, we're proud to announce he's never dropped the ball and he's never lost yardage. So you've kept that perfect record going. Jerry wrote his master's thesis and his doctoral thesis on C.S. Lewis. He's authored or co-authored 3 books on C.S. Lewis. He has preached or lectured on Lewis at 60 colleges and universities in 24 different countries and in 32 states. And he's also something of a walking encyclopedia about C.S. Lewis. So if you're wondering about a quotation or an idea, you can always call Jerry or talk to Jerry and he'll amplify that for you, usually giving you the exact wording of the passage that you're looking for. A longtime friend of the Wade, one who's been on the board, one who's been a widely acclaimed charismatic speaker, and someone who's also equally acclaimed as a host for our other speakers, a very generous heart. So I think I'll turn things over to Jerry to talk about perhaps Lewis's least well-known work and least understood work. So at some point this evening, we're expecting the scales to fall from our eyes. So Jerry, please take the podium.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here with you, and I have to apologize up front. I'm going to read this paper, and usually I'm a little in my ADHD way, just tending to drift off here and there, but this should keep us in a more linear direction, so bear with me if it's not how it usually goes. I'm grateful to be here. Walter, I'm really grateful for you. Thank you. We've been friends for, I figured it out, 36 years I think it's been. So that's kind of fun. Dymer is a little-known narrative poem written by C.S. Lewis before he became a Christian. Consequently, those only interested in Lewis's post-conversion perspective often overlook it. Nevertheless, to understand Lewis as a multifaceted writer, Dymer is very significant. And those who want to do serious Lewis study must not overlook the riches found in this early work. I intend to show that Lewis's Dymer is an important work, even though it is probably one of his most neglected. It is better developed than any of his narrative poems, and thus it reveals best the kind of work he was doing when he dreamed of becoming a poet. And furthermore, Dymer has in seed form several big ideas that, when later coupled with faith, bear the fruit of his central literary themes. Therefore, the poem should be considered a prequel of what is to come in the imaginative works that he would later produce. It must also be added that while Lewis's vocational dream to be a poet would never become a reality, his disciplined and economical use of words are originally on public display in this text. Reality is iconoclastic. The poet, Lewis, was preoccupied with disappointments and dashed hopes. Things seldom happened as expected. His mother died when he was only 9. He was born with the deformity of his thumbs that made him awkward and at school games the subject of derision. He grew pessimistic. In his first meeting with his tutor, William T. Kirkpatrick, he was chided for having a preconceived notion of what Surrey, England was like, a place Lewis had never seen until then. Added to this, his war experiences, and it's not surprising to discover that Lewis would engage his imagination in developing a story where the primary character wrestles with these preoccupations. To the degree anyone might struggle with such things, Dymer becomes an everyman through whom Lewis imaginatively explores what becomes one of his biggest ideas. Reality is iconoclastic. An iconoclast breaks idols. Any developing image on any topic can calcify and become rigid. When this occurs, a developing image becomes something like an idol, thereby truncating growth. In this lecture, I will show that Lewis uses the character Dymer to wrestle imaginatively with this idea. Lewis wrote, "We do not enjoy a story fully at the first reading, not till the curiosity, the sheer narrative lust has been given its sop and laid to sleep, are we at leisure to enjoy the real beauties. Till then it's like wasting great wine on a ravenous natural thirst, which merely wants cold wetness." This first of the 3 lectures in this series familiarizes the listener with the narrative sop and explores the big theme Lewis imaginatively develops around his central character. With all my road before me. With all my road before me. These words come from the first verse of the first canto of Dymer. The signal and clarion call is clear. The main character, Dymer, is at the beginning of an adventure full of high hopes and aspiration. In addition, as we readers lean into the text, we wonder where we will be taken. His story becomes our story, imaginatively speaking. The language is evocative of adventures which lie ahead of the protagonist. Dymer is young, naive, and full of ambition. He has hopes and expectations before him. The unexpected bruisings are yet to come. Could these words, "with all my road before me," give the reader a hint of the author's own enthusiasm for the prospects he had before him as well? Excited, hopeful expectations, wondering where the publication of this book might lead? Perhaps, but probably not. Lewis, at the end of a later decade, would write that we do not study an author's books to discover who the author is. In fact, he argued that we look through the author's eyes, but not at him. We see what he sees. We use the author as spectacles. We do not make a spectacle of him or her. Some may suggest that the practice of trying to identify an author's autobiographical features within his book is a violation of literary criticism, a demonstration of what Lewis called the personal heresy. In reality, Lewis warns critics against trying to analyze the author who's not present, meanwhile avoiding the very text before them. Such a practice in criticism would be analogous to the informal fallacy known as a red herring, that is, to become distracted from the task at hand in order to chase after something that is, to the point, irrelevant. Nevertheless, it would be short-sighted to suggest that the author never uses anything from his own experience to tell a story. In fact, Lewis writes of the shared imagination as a creative asset that draws on one's personal experience in a way that allows connection with the shared experience of others. Thus, a deeper connection can occur imaginatively between the author and reader, to the degree that they recognize a link in their respective lives. So too in this story, Lewis intends to draw his readers into the narrative. He rightly knows that virtually all who have set out on adventures tend to come to them with excitement and wonder, perhaps even with a measure of fear of the unknown. He uses what he knows of himself, others, and life in general to bond as one, author, reader, and story. Furthermore, one can almost feel Lewis's excitement as he is on the threshold of his literary career. He still has the hopes that he might one day emerge as a great poet. Those dreams had not yet crashed for him into disappointment. The reader knows that Lewis would achieve great success as a writer, but it would not come about as poet. Nevertheless, Dymer still contains themes in seed that suggest the fruit of things to come. The book met with some positive reviews and almost no sales. Nonetheless, it remains significant for all who want to understand Lewis's imaginative development. Why is Dymer so important? Given its place at the beginning of the Lewis corpus, Dymer is important in the same way that an acorn is important to the oak. Dymer is Lewis's only full-length narrative poem. Because of this, it is a literary artifact representing his early career as a poet. The lengthy poem was published in book form 5 years before he became a Christian. Apart from his journal and his early letters, Dymer is the longest work available to readers that captures his sustained pre-Christian voice. Why is this important? Well, as Lewis himself acknowledged very early on in his academic career, humanity does not pass through phases as a train passes through stations. Being alive, it has the privilege of always moving, yet never leaving anything behind. Whatever we have been in some sort, we are still. Towards the end of his life, he still believes this and writes that the process of growing up is to be valued for what we gain, not for what we lose. The question is one of continuity. Lewis acknowledged that mere change is not growth. Growth is a synthesis of change and continuity, and where there is no continuity, there is no growth. He explains further, they accuse us of arrested development because we have not lost a taste we had in childhood. But surely arrested development consists not in refusing to lose old things, but in failing to add new things. I now enjoy Tolstoy and Jane Austen and Trollope, as well as fairy tales, and I call that growth. If I had to lose the fairy tales in order to acquire the novelists, I would not say that I had grown, but only that I had changed. A tree grows because it adds rings. A train doesn't grow by leaving one station behind and puffing on to the next. Lewis acknowledged that what he became after his conversion had continuity with the man he once had been. Consequently, Dymer allows a student of Lewis's work to see how the early workings of his creative imagination allowed him to tease out an idea through a story. Nevertheless, Dymer continues to be overlooked. Perhaps the neglect is because it is a pre-conversion publication. Perhaps the neglect is due to its being a long narrative poem. It is certainly a work of art, but unfortunately, the kind of thing seldom read anymore and therefore little discussed. Perhaps for some, the neglect is due to its being less accessible. Whatever the case, I want to show that it is an important book in the Lewis corpus. As Wordsworth wrote that the child is the father of man, it could be said that Dymer is the father of Lewisian literature. In other words, Dymer, like Lewis's wardrobe door, opens a unique door into the literary imagination of Lewis. How might this be so? As has been mentioned, Lewis set his heart and mind on becoming a poet. It was his first choice of vocation. He studied great narrative poetry, Beowulf, The Romance of the Rose, Dante's Divine Comedy, the Arthurian lore, Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, Spenser's The Faerie Queene, Milton's Paradise Lost, and Robert Browning's The Ring and the Book were among his favorites. These books inspired him. In addition, he hoped to write an equally memorable way. Nevertheless, significant recognition was not forthcoming, nor was there much encouragement to continue with the kind of focused energy he poured into Dymer. Even so, good came from Lewis's efforts, and it is a good worthy to be studied. What kind of good? Through the practice of a poet, he learned to use words economically. He disciplined himself to be precise. He practiced the art of clarity and mastered the power of depiction. The words he used as a poet mattered. Consequently, his later prose would benefit significantly. He honed his gifts. As a poet, Lewis also learned to write for the ear, increasing his skill at rhythmic cadence and meter. This was also adapted to his prose, and it explains why Lewis is so easy to read aloud and clarifies why nobody wants to read him in a hurry. However, there's more. Lewis was a master of using literary form to match what he wanted to say. He wrote that when a man writes a love sonnet, he not only loves the beloved, he also loves the sonnet. Similarly, he wrote sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said. Furthermore, when Lewis chose to write science fiction, his interest was not in depicting technology. He wanted to write romantic literature, to stir up longing in his readers for places that could not be geographically situated. The Christian Lewis sought to awaken longing for other worlds. For Lewis, a literary classic was a book people desired to read and reread. Perhaps they returned to these books in much the same way a child, after hearing a delightful fairy story, exclaims, "Read it again." Why? Lewis suggests it's because the child desires to return to that world. It speaks of that part of every one of us that longs to go through the looking glass to another world, or through a wardrobe door, travel on the wings of the north wind, or ride a tornado into Oz. In fact, Lewis suggests it awakens in us the longing ultimately for the only other world we could ever really know, which is heaven. Lewis used science fiction as a literary form that framed best what he wanted to say. He said a writer selects his form as a sculptor selects his marble. Dymer reveals that very early in his literary career, Lewis was already cultivating the practice of selecting a manner to fit his matter, a form to fit his purposes. So what might this reveal about Dymer? While a narrative poem can be the vehicle for many things, for Lewis it was a form suitable for myth. Myth simply means story. But as Lewis used the word, he had in mind a story that captured something that was extra literary. It worked upon the reader by its particular flavor or quality, rather as a smell or a chord does. Furthermore, it deals with impossibles and preternaturals. It is always grave and awe-inspiring. We feel it to be numinous. It is as if some great moment had been communicated to us. Lewis loved to read myth, and he clearly enjoyed creating and telling one. Though Lewis was no more a Christian when he wrote Dymer than Virgil was when he wrote the Aeneid, nevertheless, both clearly wrote in a way that suggests something beyond the natural world. In reading the Norse myths, Lewis says he experienced an awe that escaped him in his childhood. In addition, he writes Dymer. As he writes Dymer, Lewis to some degree awakens in his reader a sense of the numinous. Both Homer and Virgil use narrative poetry as the vehicles for their myths. Lewis used the same vehicle. The literary form suggests Lewis's deliberate imaginative intention for the work, to write a myth that allows him to explore the idea that reality is iconoclastic. In a preface to Paradise Lost, Lewis distinguished between two types of literary form for communicating myth: primary epic and secondary epic. Primary epic is the kind of narrative used by Homer. It is characterized by objectivity. That is, the objects described are before the writer's imagination and set before the reader. Nothing is hidden. However, the interior life of the characters is hidden, never revealed. It is of little consequence to the telling of the story. The emotions of the characters are in the rear guard of the action. Secondary epic, on the other hand, is used by Virgil in the Aeneid. While Lewis is no Virgil and Dymer is no Aeneid, nevertheless, Lewis pinned his Dymer as a kind of secondary epic, similar to that used by Virgil. A brief explanation using some of Lewis's own thoughts on the matter might clarify what he was attempting to do, and in that way his Dymer bears at least a faint stylistic echo of the Aeneid. Movement and transformation characterize secondary epic. Aeneas is fleeing Troy, the city of his birth, as the Greeks are sacking it. Similarly, Dymer flees his city with its tyrannies. Aeneas leaves behind him the ashes of what once was, but he will never lose the memory. Nevertheless, he's moving towards something that is yet to be, the building of Rome. Lewis observes the transformation of the little remnant of the old into the germ of the new, hence the sadness of farewells, the clarity of new beginnings, so conspicuously brought together in the opening of Book 3, dominate the whole poem. Virgil's story has both the objective world of the story in view, but the reader also feels deeply the subjectivity of the characters. In Dymer, Lewis does something similar. Lewis continues, "It is the nature of vocation to appear to men in the double character of a duty and desire," and Virgil does justice to both. The element of desire is brought out in all those passages where the Hesperian land is hinted, prophesied, and dim discovered. This is a very portrait of a vocation, a thing that calls or beckons, that calls inexorably. Yet you must strain your ears to catch a voice that insists on being sought, yet refuses to be found. Lewis's Dymer also begins to realize he has such a vocation and calling. Lewis observes to follow the vocation does not mean happiness, but once it has been heard, there is no happiness for those who do not follow. Lewis, translating Virgil, captures something of the sentiment of Dymer, twixt miserable longing for the present land and far realms that call them by fate's command. He continues, it will be seen that in these two lines, Virgil, with no intention of allegory, has described once and for all the very quality of most human life as it is experienced by anyone who has not yet risen to holiness or sunk to animality. In this regard, Lewis notes of Virgil, he has become almost a great poet. In making his one legend symbolical of the destiny of Rome, he has willy-nilly symbolized the destiny of man. Lewis observes that if one were to develop beyond Virgil, it will be towards religious poetry. In addition, I might add, whether he intended it or not, that is what Lewis has also done in Dymer. Those who read it realize that the pre-converted Lewis has taken them to the threshold of what is to come. The Christian writer will emerge imminently. This is one more reason why those interested in Lewis should familiarize themselves with this book. Dymer's a story. And Lewis observed of stories that to be stories at all, they must be series events. But it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or quality. What Lewis does in Dymer is to engage the reader in a way that awakens hunger for something beyond the written page. He says if the author's plot is only a net, and usually an imperfect one, a net of time and event for catching what is not really a process at all, is life much more. The narrative sop. Dymer is a pilgrimage story. The story is rather simple and must be told briefly before analyzing the narrative. Dymer is a young man living in a tyrannical city. While he is being indoctrinated, coerced, and forced to fit into the wishes of his instructors and conditioners, he notices through the window a real spring day. The lines of demarcation contrasting the artificialities of the city and the real world fresh to his senses is too strong. Dymer rises, strikes the lecturer dead, and bolts from the city. He turns from the false to the real. In his quest, he comes upon a castle, and there in the dark he discovers a woman and fornicates with her. In the morning he leaves the castle, but wishing to return, he finds an old hag guarding the door and inhibiting his every attempt to return to the maiden. Dejected, he wanders, seeking to find his way. Eventually he happens upon a young man, wounded, blinded, and dying. Dymer seeks to provide comfort and hears his story. To his shock, the young man curses the name of Dymer. Concealing his own identity, Dymer learns from this man that on the heels of his flight from the city, an insurgent named Bran led a rebellion against the city, and many revolted with him. Bran, nevertheless, in dictator-like fashion, turns on some of those who accompanied him in his rebellion, and this is how the wounded man suffers his fate. After the young man dies, Dymer wanders again, remorseful and contemplative. In his sorrow, he notices the beauty of the natural world around him, and it is enough to give him some respite from the sadness he's experienced. Then he notices a lark, and a moment later he hears the crack of a gun, and the lark falls dead. Dymer, saddened yet further, makes his way to a house with a belfry whose clock is not working, and the garden so overgrown blocks all sight and suggestion of the outside world. There Dymer meets a magician who drugs him, prompting him to dream salacious dreams. Dymer succumbs only to discover the spell is being fostered upon him. The dreams are not real. Dymer resists and is shot by the magician. Wounded and wandering, he comes upon a goddess who gives perspective to all Dymer has so far endured. He leaves to face his fate. He must engage in battle with the offspring he produced from the trysts that occurred at the castle. Dymer is killed, and with his death all nature awakens and flourishes. Here the story ends. Now I will recount a sampling from the details of the story that support my thesis that Lewis is imaginatively developing the theme, reality is iconoclastic. Reality is iconoclastic depicted in Dymer. Continuity and change, a cousin of the iconoclastic nature of reality, is one of the threads woven throughout the fabric of Dymer. Change of some sort will constantly be required of Dymer during his adventures. New discoveries demand re-examination of any present conceptual framework. Whatever I once thought will be subject to modification. These moments of disequilibrium signal the need for change. Do I need a change of kind, utterly rejecting my past way of thinking? Or will the change required be the assimilation of the new, incorporating it into a growing understanding? The new awareness and the accompanying change, helpful as it may be, also presents another fresh and related challenge. If I hold too tightly to the newly acquired image, it will begin to compete against a growing understanding and retard further development. Reality must act as the iconoclast once again. Change for mutable and thus developing creatures will always be necessary. This idea, which will echo throughout the corpus of Lewis, has its first great expression in this canto of Dymer. Lewis introduces the reader to Dymer, a young inhabitant of a tyrannical city. The city was an attempt to build the utopian ideal of Plato's Republic. The Platonists have built the city, forcing their ideas into brick and mortar. They laid the strong foundations, torturing into stone each bubble that the academy had blown, Lewis writes. By indicating the incongruities of bubbles forced into stone, Lewis makes his judgment clear. There is nonsense in the endeavor. Theories of the universe are not the universe. These theories may represent the best thoughts one may have of a given tract of reality, but they're not to be confused for last words or final expressions of what the world is or ought to be ultimately. What finite individual or oligarchy can exercise such control and avoid all the risks of evil? Those like Dymer, who question the present order of things, are a threat to the city's existing order. Those who ask questions or challenge convention are deemed as rebels. The goal of this city is uniformity and conformity. The utopia becomes a dystopia. The inhabitants with scorn label their world the perfect city. Lewis's emphasis is on the artificiality and pretense the city has become. Lewis describes the unnaturalness of the city and its effects on Dymer. For 19 years they worked upon his soul, refining, chipping, molding, and adorning. Then came the moment that undid the whole, the ripple of rude life without a warning. It came in lecture time one April morning. Alas, whoever learned to censor the spring days? The contrast of the real spring day with the pretense of the false and forged city is explicit. This particular spring day was real. The city was spectral. Dymer sees the vision of the world cast by his teachers as a false one. He will have no more of it. One is struck by the fact that though the conditioners and planners of the city seek to indoctrinate Dymer to their vision of life, and though they work for 19 years refining, chipping, molding him to be what they want him to be, it only took one moment of real life to overturn the falsehood. While being told what to think, a gentle breeze from the outside world reaches his cheek through an open window. A brown bird perches on the sill, and Dymer is stirred. The images are particularized, seemingly insignificant, but real, and therefore great contrast to what he's hearing in the lecture hall. He laughs aloud at the absurdity, a proper response. The real he now sees makes nonsense of the lecture. The teacher seeks to silence him. Dymer, disappointed by the falsehood he has had to endure and acting with the impetuousness of youth, strikes the lecturer dead and bolts from the city. Down the white street and past the gate and forth, beyond the wall he came to grassy places. The street of the city is colorless and unreal, whereas the image of grassy places suggests greenness, nature, life, and growth. Dymer hears music and following it finds that it leads him to embrace emotions otherwise long suppressed by the unrealities of the city. Again, this revealing of the subject's emotions is characteristic of secondary epic. The music is also emblematic of the real world he is now discovering, a world so different from the one he has left behind. The music feeds his imagination and caters to his sense of wonder, long stifled by the machinations of the Platonists. Lewis observes that music could have crumbled proud belief without doubt and turned the young man's feet to pilgrimage, so sharp it was, so sure a path it found, soulward, with stabbing wounds of bitter sound. Dymer's soul is awakened from the deadening indoctrinations of the city. The city stifled his soul. Now the objective world enlivens real life. He follows a path through the woods and eventually comes to a manor house or castle. He enters and finds it empty. In Canto 2, Lewis develops the theme further as undeception. While in the castle, several depictions reveal Dymer's growing surrender to reality. As Dymer bolts from the falsehood and pretense of the city, in this canto, he must bolt from the falsehoods and pretense that exist in his own imagined sense of self. First, he enters the castle. He's startled by the image of a man. Thinking a challenger is confronting him, he sets himself up for a fight, only to discover he was looking at a mirror. Recognizing himself in the mirror, he smiles before it, wondering like a child. Here Lewis posits wonder as a proper response to finding things as they are, as opposed to a lack of wonder when one is merely projecting and in full control of the manufactured image. This is a foretaste of what will occur later in the poem. Second, in verse 10, Dymer looks again into the mirror, till suddenly he started with surprise, catching by chance his own familiar eyes, fevered, yet still the same, without their share of bravery, undeceived and watching there. Though Dymer sees himself in this mirror, Lewis makes the point that one glance at an object is never enough. The real world in which Dymer now finds himself demands more from him. He's undeceived and far less courageous than he first assumed. Nevertheless, this moment of undeception and self-awareness is only temporary. There will be more to come. Third, as Dymer leaves the mirror to continue his exploration of the castle, Lewis says the boy went on manly playing at manhood, suggesting that the hero of the poem still lacks what it is he must become. As the story continues, Dymer enters a chamber in the night and discovers the breathing body of a girl. Overcome with selfish desire, he sleeps with her. There's a premonition that the consequences will follow from this act, for Lewis writes, it sent young wolves thirsting after blood. Fourth, in this experience in the castle, and what immediately follows, Dymer quickly discovers that the real world is one fraught with pain. He awakens from his night of rapture, wondering where he is and what it was that happened the night before. He leaves the castle impulsively, and Lewis adds, out of this unscythed grass, the nettle grew. The green grass of spring that once symbolizes escape from the city has now sprouted nettles. Here suddenly he realizes the self-centeredness of his act the night before. He failed even to learn the name of the maiden. His carnal rapture was not about a relationship between two people with all of its objective complexity, but it was the mere satisfying of appetite without respect for this other person, whoever she was. In denying her the dignity she deserved, that is, in denying her humanity, his own humanity is diminished. Consequently, he begins to feel guilty. This is something that did not occur to him when he murdered his teacher. The guilt is a sign he is encountering a more complex grasp of reality. His conscience is awakening. He returns to the manor in hope of finding the young woman. To his dismay, he only finds an immense old hag waiting at the door. He tries desperately to enter the castle again in order to find the young woman, who is fast becoming his idealized beloved. Unfortunately, every entrance is blocked and barred by the hag. He is initially filled with bravado, vowing to rescue the maiden, but his courage fails him. He is further undeceived. He begs the hag to let him enter, and she strikes Dymer, wounding him on his heart. Defeated, Dymer staggers away from the castle and wanders into the wood thinking about his beloved. Lewis's former student and biographer George Sayre observes, much of the rest of the poem is the story of his quest for her, for a being whose nature he knows very little. Certainly this is partially true, but not utterly. Dymer is also questing for his true self. That is, he must discover his place in the objective world around him. He must discover the true nature of the world that exists independent of his thoughts and perceptions about it. The continuity of his development as a character depends upon an accurate grasp of his world. He must break free of the self-referential and utilitarian and become self-aware and empathetic. Lewis develops the iconoclast theme further in Canto 4. Dymer makes another horrifying discovery. The reality is that his escape from the city had consequences he never intended. Reality and pain of the real world become more profound and pronounced. leading to Dymer's increased self-awareness. Having turned away from the castle, Dymer comes upon a man wounded, moaning, and blinded, lying near death. Dymer seeks to comfort him and asks to hear his story. The man says that he once lived in the perfect city where all had been well until the day that a rebel named Dymer at one blow brought ruin on us all. Dymer's shocked as the wounded man projects onto him motives that were not his. Lewis has Dymer see in this dying man's story the consequence of his own impetuous act. The man projects his contempt onto Dymer, unaware that it is actually Dymer who is now acting as his father confessor. Nevertheless, Dymer is forced to see himself as others see him. His sense of self cannot be fully realized in isolation from others. Lewis's lifelong friend and fellow Inkling, Owen Barfield, wrote, "The experience of oneself over against that which is not oneself is a sine qua non of human consciousness." Remorse for what has occurred in the wake of his bolt from the city moves him. Dymer listens quietly to the man's tale. There are incongruities between the man's story depicting Dymer as a mere rebel and the reality as Dymer perceived it. This sets the stage for the introduction of Bran, an actual rebel, who calls others to join him in the destruction of the city, shouting Dymer's name as a rallying cry. Bran is not guided by objective transcendent values, nor does he have any real community to bring checks and balances into his life. He was not motivated by an awareness of spring days or birds roosting on windowsills. He does not have anyone's welfare in mind but his own, nor does he look beyond himself for some source of moral guidance. He is truly an anarchist, and at his heels 100 murderers ran, with prisoners now clamoring to take and try them, and burn them, wedge their nails up, crucify them. Lewis shows the mindlessness of the rebellion and the self-referential rhetoric of its leader, who with maddening words dethrones the minds of men. The motivation of these rebels is nothing more than doom and strong delusion. Dymer is told wherever the most shame was done, the doer called on Dymer's name. The dying man explains that Bran's tyrannies were such that he would even turn on his own, and that he himself was a victim of Bran's violence. The man wishes he had health and could avenge himself on Dymer for the harm he has suffered. Dymer stays at his side until he dies. Lewis contrasts Dymer's flight with Bran's destruction of the city. Dymer seeks escape into the real, while Bran tries to assert his will and destroy. Bran's approach is portrayed as evil. He is a precursor to the more developed villains in Lewis's mature work. He is self-referential and utilitarian. He will use anyone and any means to force his own will on the world around him. As for Dymer, he was undeceived in the recognition of his cowardice in Canto 3 and the discovery of the consequences of his bolt from the city here. A new challenge. Skipping ahead to Cantos 6 and 7, Lewis develops this theme further. Dymer sets out in hope of a new beginning. He says, "Pack up the dreams and let the life begin." Once again, he notices it is spring, tying this part of his pilgrimage with his original act of stepping out of the city on a spring day. Then it is with a jarring shock that Dymer hears the firing of a gun. He rushes off to investigate and comes to another house. It is hidden behind a yew hedge, a house with a clock tower, but a clock that had no hands and told no hour. The clock signals that Dymer is stepping into a place where the time of the real world is of no consequence. It foreshadows what he will find at the house, for its master, a magician who traffics in dreams, dwells in a world out of time. As he arrives at the house, the magician asks if Dymer heard his gun, announcing without remorse that he killed the lark. Dymer's horrified at this news and speaks of his sorrow. The magician justifies his heinous act, announcing that the singing of these birds interrupts his dreams. George Sayre underscores what the reader has already discerned. Everything about the master of the house is evil. The magician has chosen the world of pseudo-reality in pursuit of his dreams. Clearly, Lewis is drawing the sharp contrast between Dymer's escape into the real world and the magician's escape from it. The magician feeds his newly arrived guest, and then Dymer, falling under a spell, drowsily tells of his experiences up to that point. The magician has no interest in the part of the story about the city or Bran's rebellion or the young dying man. He wants to hear of the woman Dymer encountered in the castle. As Professor Chad Walsh notes, the magician has no interest in the visible world except as an entrance into the invisible. The magician tells Dymer that he can teach him the art of dreaming so that he will be able to have the woman whenever he wants her. At this moment, the two argue. Dymer, still alert, says, "Dreams. I have had my dream too long," I thought. "The sun rose for my sake." The difference between Dymer's quest for the real and the magician's for the self-referential are again sharply contrasted. The magician, valuing control over others, seeks to further his own interest. Consequently, the magician seeks to persuade Dymer that his true fulfillments lie not in a realm inhabited by an actual woman, but rather the dream world. There he too can have control over his circumstances, ensuring that he will meet the woman whenever he chooses. This idea is confusing to Dymer, but he's weak. The magician has baited his trap and nearly caught his prey. The master smiled. "You are in haste. For broken dreams, the cure is dream again and deeper." Dymer, still sorrowing over the report of Bran and the rebellion he inspired, asks the magician if these dreams can wipe out blood guiltiness and undo what's done amiss and bid the thing that has been be no more. Dymer is willing to do whatever will help him ease his sorrows. His pain is real, and the dreams are not. Nevertheless, to salve his guilt artificially, Dymer is persuaded to enter into the magician's world of falsehoods. Moreover, the magician takes full advantage of this opportunity and says that the things Dymer longs for can only be found in dreams. In dreams, the fool is free from scorning voices. Gray-headed whores are virgin there again. There the stain of oldest sins. How do the good words go? Though they were scarlet, shall be white as snow. Dymer's desire is to fix that which is broken in him. The magician, by contrast, has no awareness of his moral deficiencies. He's in denial of all that is real. Dymer's longing to restore his broken soul cannot be found in a world of make-believe. A reader cannot help but wonder, what was on Lewis's mind as he wrote this? He seems to portray accurately the desire of anyone, such as Dymer, who would like to set right the things he's done, especially if his acts resulted in hurt to others. Dymer longs to have his sins atoned for. The magician says that only dreams can set things right. Again, what was Lewis thinking about such matters at this time in his own life? Did he have such regrets? Did he think the regrettable could be atoned for? Or was it the destiny of fallen men to live alone and isolated in the consequences of past sins? There's really, at this point, no way to know. What is clear is that he is imaginatively depicting the struggle in Dymer's story. Here, Dymer's struggle is depicted, not Lewis's. Moreover, here, for Dymer, it is a struggle of conscience, awakened by tensions in the real world. At this point in the poem, the magician says that guilt is also merely a dream. It has no point of reference in an artificial world of dreams and imaginings. Dymer, nearly persuaded by the magician's manipulations, comes again to his senses by thoughts of his beloved. He would much rather remain in the waking world if he knew it would lead to the possibility he might see her again. He would muster whatever courage was necessary if he could be assured of his goal. At the mere mention of courage, the magician begins discounting the benefits of virtue. He scoffs at the character necessary to live in the objective world. In fact, he tries to prevent Dymer from developing any kind of virtue whatsoever. In time, Dymer succumbs to the persistence of the magician, who has prepared a sleeping potion for him. Just before he succumbs to the power of the dreaming spell, he says to the magician, "Oh, lies, all lies! Why did you kill the lark?" Dymer remembers the real world as he slips into unconsciousness. As Dymer falls under the magician's spell, Lewis makes the magician's evil intent explicit. He laughed out loud, only once, then looked around him, hushed and cowed. Like a man having something to hide, he gloats at the spell under which he has put his victim, but only as he first looks around to see that no one watching eye observes his deed. His reaction indicates two things. First, He has clearly violated any kind of transcendent value, and he seems to know it. Second, as he looks over his shoulder in fear of being found out, he does so knowingly. It is an indication his act against Dymer is evil. While Dymer sleeps, the magician, like a dog returning to his vomit, goes to his bookshelves. These shelves are full of the books and tools of his necromancy. Lewis makes clear that the magician is a lost soul. Not willing to be content within his own misery, he must destroy others as well. With all of this working against him, Dymer stirs from his dream, and waking he cries out one word, water. It is thirst for water from the real world that breaks the dream spell. The actual longing brings Dymer back to his senses. He drinks one glass and asks immediately for another, emphasizing how simply his illusions can be corrected. Reality is iconoclastic. As he drinks, Dymer chides the magician, saying his world of dreams is all lies. The magic is all accursed. He tells the magician that it was wrong to send him to the world of dreams, for I sought a living spirit and found instead bogies and wraiths. The explicit image makes the contrast very clear. Dymer has grown through all of his misadventures to prefer the real to the artificial. The magician, practiced at ignoring reality and unmoved by Dymer's chiding, simply asks to hear about the dream. What motivates the magician to make such a request? He may be seeking to woo Dymer back into the world from which he has just escaped. Perhaps his senses, so dulled by evil, are now addicted to falsehood. Any report from the dream world is more highly valued than things in the real. Again, like a dog returning to his vomit, the magician grovels for whatever grubs will satisfy his palate. Oddly enough, in a manner incongruous with his contempt for the magician, Dymer complies and begins to tell the story of his dream. Of course, his story is necessary for the continuance of the narrative, but it is an awkward moment in the poem. Lewis gives no reason why Dymer should grant the magician's request. Nevertheless, Dymer shares his dream. Undeceived, he knows these dreams were nothing more than his own imaginative projections. He says, I was making everything I saw too sweet, far too well fitted to desire to be a living thing. At this point, Dymer desperately wants the world as it is, with all of its risks and dangers. He prefers it to all that is false and made up. The Dymer who left the artificialities of the perfect city would now equally escape those artificialities of his own imagination. Dymer is maturing. All of this has some degree of continuity with where he has been before. Again, whether he's addicted to the dream world or merely desires to ensnare Dymer in another trap, the magician asks if Dymer found the woman he sought in the dream. After affirming that she was there, the magician asks, was she not fair? Then he adds, almost a living soul. Again, he seeks to persuade Dymer to prefer the unreal to the real. And Dymer sees through the magician's manipulative rhetoric and refuses to take the bait. He objects to the magician's worlds of dreams, noting, but every part was what I made it. All that I had dreamed, no more, no less, the mirror of my heart. Such things as boyhood feigns beneath the smart of solitude and spring. I was deceived. Dymer continues to recount his dream for the magician. He speaks of the lady's words to him. Her sweetness drew a veil before my eyes. She seeks to woo by saying that the shadowlands of earth were really only loved and desired for the world of the dream. She falsely claims that the real world is only a substitute. She tells Dymer that he has at last come to his home, and she begins to worship him. It is at this point that Dymer asks a moral question and brings matters of good and evil into the arena. Is it not wrong that men's delusion should be made so strong? The temptation to succumb to the dream is strong in him, but a moment comes when the spell is at last broken. Though he has been nearly wrecked, Dymer says, she went too fast. Soft to my arms she came. The robe slipped from her shoulder. The smooth breast was bare against my own. She shone like flame before me in the dusk. All love, all shame, faugh! And it was myself. In realizing the truth that the woman in his dream is nothing but his own projection, Dymer breaks free of the spell finally and asks for water. Here Lewis begins to tie the various parts of the poem together. The woman in the dream is of his own manufacture. The woman in the dream is of his own manufacture, is not unlike the perfect city, which was the manufacture of the Platonists. Both were equally false notions of reality. It was necessary for Dymer to escape the unreality of the city and now this world of dreams. Something as simple as spring awakened him from the one world, and now something as simple as a thirst for water awakens him from the other. As Dymer sets out to leave the house, the magician raises his gun and shoots him. The event at the magician's house began with the shooting of the lark, the destruction of any reality that threatens the magician's dream, and in the end the magician shoots Dymer because his developing commitments to the real world are also a threat to the magician. He will have his way. His uncorrected falsehoods sustain him in his evil acts. He does not value others, only himself. He lacks piety and a sense of justice. He's incapable of rendering to others their due. He prefers to destroy the living in order to maintain the artificial. His place in Dymer's story is to deepen Dymer's grasp of the consequences of suppressing the inexorable demands of reality. Another discovery still to make. Wounded, Dymer is ever more sensitive to the objective world. While it is not visible, the wind is more real than the things he has encountered in the two preceding cantos. It is not merely that Dymer notices a clock, he also notices the detail that it strikes the quarter of the hour. He has escaped the dreams of the magician's house, whose faceless clock has no hands and whose world is out of beat with the objective world, to discover a clock whose time is measured and precise. As he travels on with thundering pain, the fog from the magician's house clears, and he sees the clouds break and the night sky spacious with sudden stars. These are real stars in a wide, wide sky. Unlike the stifling make-believe world of the dreams, though wounded, he has escaped. In this real world, he is surprised to come upon the actual woman he has been seeking all along. He asks if she is the loved one, the long lost, and staring at her asks, "Truly?" She replies, "Truly indeed." This again establishes the reality of the world where Dymer finds himself, and it contrasts with the world of the magician from which he has just come. Still, he has his doubts. He wants to be sure that the woman is not one more phantom to beguile. The reality of this experience is marked by the fact that the clock's bell tolled out another quarter. Dymer asks that she leave him, for he suspects that she is a god who cannot understand all he has suffered. Not denying she's deity, she corrects him and says, the gods themselves know pain, the eternal forms. She says she is in fact familiar with pain and suffering. He wants to know if it was the gods who called him out of the city, and if so, has he sinned by following them? He does not give her time to answer before he asks, what for him is the more important question? Must things of dust guess their own way in the dark? To which she answers, they must. Dymer responds with wrath, wanting to know why she'd come in human shape, in sweet disguise, wooing me, lurking for me in my path, snared me with shows of love, and all was lies. The answer is difficult for Dymer, for the goddess says our kind must come to all, if bidden, but in the shape for which they call. She eventually tells him that he must now go forth, the journey is not yet ended. The goddess reveals to Dymer the very purpose for his journey. She says that certainly he has already seen himself dead and on the bier many times before. And in fact, Dymer has slain himself every hour. It is an enigma. But as Dymer turns to question the goddess further, she's gone. In a passage prefiguring much of Lewis's mature work, Dymer reflects on the fact that there have been many Dymers. Yet life's experience, every new encounter with reality have lain to rest each Dymer for another one who was yet emerging. He speculates about his own pilgrimage. There was a Dymer once who worked and played about the city. I sloughed him off and ran. There was a Dymer in the forest glade, ranting alone, sulking the fates of man. I cast him also, and a third began. And he too died, but I am none of those. There is another still to die. Who knows? Dymer's growing. He experiences continuity and change. His life is becoming more real and authentic. He is in process. What is emerging is continually being defined and redefined by his adjustment to reality. A final word has not been uttered about him, just as it cannot be uttered about any man. Helen Joy Davidman visited Lewis for the Christmas holidays in 1952. Lewis wrote in her copy of The Great Divorce, "There are three great images in my mind which I must continually forsake and replace by better ones. The false image of God, the false image of my neighbors, and the false image of myself." C.S. Lewis, 30 December 1952, from an unwritten chapter on iconoclasm. Even though this chapter was yet unwritten, it would appear that it was in some ways anticipated by this canto in Dymer. Dymer struggles to get to a belfried place. He passes through an old gate and finds himself in a cemetery. The portent of another death and the wonder of what new Dymer may yet emerge is here anticipated. Dymer meets a sentry in that place who's guarding against the intrusion of a monster. The sentry tells Dymer the tale of the beast's origin, and to his shock, Dymer discovers that he is the father. The monster is the offspring of the tryst with the woman in the castle. For some reason, which Lewis never fully provides, Dymer decides that he must either slay the beast or be slain by it. As the dawn breaks and the beast arrives, Dymer sees the region as a ruinous land. He faces the beast and it kills him in an instant. In that very moment came the rising sun, and with it the ruinous land sprouts forth vegetation, and the brute becomes a god. Thus ends the story of Dymer. In his preface to the 1950 edition of the poem, Lewis says of Dymer, hunger and shock of real danger bring him to his senses, and he at last accepts reality. A concluding word about Dymer. Even though the consequences of his past sins haunt him, Dymer grows by virtue of his honesty. With all of his mistakes and failures, he nevertheless looks at the real world and accommodates himself to it. He chooses to redress his wrongs and accepts his fate by facing the monster whose very existence is a consequence of his indulgent fantasies. The non-Christian Lewis has Dymer atone for his own sins. Nothing approximates vicarious atonement in this book. Nevertheless, Dymer's choice to face reality, even if such a choice reveals flaws of character, is presented as a likely aid to set him on a right track. In his introduction to The Great Divorce, Lewis notes, when one sets out on a wrong road, there's no making it the right road any more than wrong figures can lead to a right sum. The only way to begin the process of fixing the error is to acknowledge the mistake and go back where it could be set right. Evil can be undone, but it cannot develop into good. Lewis in Dymer imaginatively depicts this. The objective demands of reality, the awareness of moral responsibility, and the consequences for one's actions are all features and evidence in the poem. These ideas seem to be looming in the background wherever Lewis is telling a story. It is true of the pre-Christian Lewis as well as the post-converted Lewis. For the student of Lewis, Dymer is the beginning and has continuity with what will follow. Lewis would come to believe the Christian story was anticipated in the early pre-Christian myths. There's no reason not to suppose that Lewis's myth may also suggest what is coming. Lewis depicts Dymer as being undeceived by reality repeatedly. In some ways, even the pre-Christian Lewis may unwittingly have provided a template for the reader to think about undeception in his or her own life. Any true encounter with reality can open doors to discover whatever might lie behind it. Lewis had not come to such a place in his own life when he wrote Dymer. Nevertheless, he did prepare an edition for republication in 1950, nearly a quarter of a century after the original publication. Why did he do this? Perhaps the Christian Lewis saw something beyond the modest literary merits of the poem that transcended any value he could have imagined when he wrote it. If this may be so, it is most likely found in the big idea that reality is iconoclastic. In The Great Divorce, George MacDonald's character says that heaven and hell are retrospective, for each works backward to transform what has gone on before. Something of heaven or hell will be evident in all of life's experience in the end. The good man's past begins to change so that his forgiven sins and remembered sorrows take on the quality of heaven. The bad man's past already conforms to his badness and is filled with dreariness. Could something like this also be apparent in Dymer? Furthermore, in Mere Christianity, Lewis notes, if you are a Christian, you don't have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. Equally, it should not be supposed everything in the pre-Christian Lewis must be overshadowed or discounted by the writings of the converted Lewis. There is much at play in Lewis's early work that anticipates the themes of his later material. This will be the subject of my next 2 lectures. But first, it was necessary here to know something of the story of Dymer as it is on the surface.
Before David introduces our respondent, I want to acknowledge that we all have busy schedules, so you should be aware that after we hear the response, we will have a short time to set up chairs for a panel discussion where we can have question and answers, and that would be the time if you must surreptitiously leave. David, introduce our respondent.
Thank you, Jerry. That was very thought-provoking. I'm like Agrippa in the King James Version. Almost I am persuaded. I'll have to come back twice more to see what else I'm missing in Dymer. Our respondent this evening is Dr. Jeffry Davis, professor of English here at Wheaton, the chair of the English department, the director of the Independent Studies major, and the dean of humanities, and probably an active scholar and teacher. I'm not quite sure how you work that in. Dr. Davis graduated from Wheaton with an English degree in 1983, earned his doctorate, and then returned as a faculty member in 1990. Apart from numerous scholarly presentations and journal articles, Dr. Davis has co-authored 2 books, one on interdisciplinary inclinations, Reflections on Integrating Liberal Arts and Faith, and one co-authored with President Philip Ryken, Liberal Arts for the Christian Life. So Dr. Davis, I'd like to welcome your response and your reflections upon Dymer.
The task before me is to provide a thoughtful reader's response to the narrative poem Dymer by Oxford professor Lewis, while at the same time responding to the analysis of that work by Professor Jerry Root, briefly assessing both for their merits. In the company of scholars such as Don King, Malcolm Geit, and Crystal Hurd, Root recognizes Dymer as an important work of literature. To this claim, I heartily respond, I agree. From a scholarly perspective, Dymer represents an overlooked literary artifact by one of the most influential English writers of the 20th century, who was certainly the greatest Christian prose writer of his age. Therefore, Lewis's early poem does possess seminal significance, as Professor Root argues, and it deserves more investigation as a form of literary craft that expresses several nascent traits and themes of the man who would later become lionized in the literal and figurative senses. Professor Root, too, has become known for his Aslanic tendencies, including his abiding interest in the work and his affection for the legendary life of that inimitable, pipe-smoking, pint-sipping Protestant saint of the Wade Center. Parenthetically speaking, Wheaton's love of Lewis remains a great irony, considering that when I was an undergraduate here and throughout my first years as a young professor, this campus, and indeed the whole town of Wheaton, was known for being dry, a trait that cannot solely be attributed to the laconic wit of Leland Ryken, longtime English professor and Lewis scholar. Were it not for the fact that Dr. Root possesses the virtues of being charitable and generous as a teacher, a colleague, and a friend, one of my dearest in the world, I would not presume to tell him and this audience this reader's response to Dymer, that the poem he so sincerely reveres is not, in my estimation, a great work of literature. Professor Root, here I must remind you of a verse from the Old Testament, Proverbs 27:6. Do you recall it? Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Besides being less than great literature, Dymer does not strike me as a text that would warmly enliven the characteristic curiosities of the typical reader of St. Louis. And here I am not speaking geographically. Great literary works are recognized in part for their remarkable influence on readers. When I say remarkable, I intend the adjective in its fullest sense with three particular renderings. First, remarkable means worthy of being recognized as extraordinary. In other words, the impact of a great literary work can be perceived in a variety of uncommon or exceptional ways, possibly described by readers with the following words: arresting, brilliant, commanding, dramatic, emphatic, fulfilling, groundbreaking, harrowing, insightful, jubilant. The list of distinctive qualifiers goes on, according to each reader's engagement with the text. However, a consensus generally emerges that a given work possesses attributes that are exemplary, meriting widespread and lasting recognition. Second, to say that a literary work is remarkable also means that it provokes a distinctly human activity of making meaningful remarks about it. As I regularly explain to advanced students of English, particularly in the senior seminar, how we respond to a work of literature is something that we should be especially mindful of, paying attention to the ways in which we as readers interact with each text and how we process our experiences, both individually and socially. Such processing of our responses is vital to a full appreciation of literary art and to the cultivation of humanity by those who engage them. So it includes then the following traits: our cognitive or rational thoughts, our emotive or sentient perceptions, and what I will call our transflective or light transmitting and reflecting considerations. And this is a borrowed term from computing sciences in reference to liquid crystal displays and applying it inventively here in an interdisciplinary manner. This portmanteau, transflective, I mean to take on the significance of the conveyance of what is transcendent. Third, great works of literature that are remarkable do something to us as readers. They mark us, shaping who we are in enduring ways. And as we engage and re-engage great texts, which is in and of itself a hallmark of a classic, they are reread, they remark us, inscribing our sensibilities with artistic power. When great works of literature remark us in this way, they live on in our memory, and they affect us consciously and unconsciously, informing how we choose to live our lives. Keeping all this in mind, I assert that Dymer is unqualified in its unremarkable qualities. Standing on its own merits, it has problems. Its literary reception supports this, its poetic deficiencies confirm this, and its originator, the erstwhile poet Lewis himself, openly acknowledges this. Nevertheless, Dymer is indeed important and iconoclastic, as Professor Root has told us. By the way, your presentation of Dymer was far better than Lewis's. So then, it is a poem that is certainly important from a scholarly standpoint. Most poignantly, the poem fulfilled an ironic purpose. It shattered for Lewis the egocentric image he had of himself as a young, proud, unregenerate poet whose dream was to be a greater poet, famous among those recognized in Westminster Abbey. Thus, Dymer can be understood as a divine catalyst in and of itself, ultimately moving Lewis away from the fantasy of self-interested poetic fame toward the reality and humility of accepting his true creative calling, primarily as a prose fiction writer. The critical reviews of Dymer, shortly after its printing in 1926, signal a decidedly mixed literary reception. And here I interpret the historical data a bit differently than George Sayer. In an issue of the Sunday Times, we find the following equivocal commentary about the publication by Clive Hamilton, the pseudonym for C.S. Lewis, who was then a newly appointed Oxford Don at Magdalen College, and who obviously wanted to protect his reputation as a scholar, especially from any potential bad press he might receive as an inferior poet. The Times critic, who at first provides a few positive words about Dymer, concludes by assessing Lewis's major mistake as an artist, selecting the wrong creative genre for the narrative's expression. The critic writes, "The voyage of the soul in search of the spirit, its struggles with fear, with the listlessness of dreams, and its final triumph are set forth with an unusual sureness. Of felicitous phrases there are many, and yet it seems to us that Mr. Hamilton has mistaken his opportunity. The idea was not one for treatment in verse. The exigencies of the poetic line prevent such an easy sequence as the allegory demands. But as a prose tale, how splendidly it would have flowed." And we saw this in your presentation, Professor Root. This assessment seems uncanny in its proclamation, boldly stating that the writer should have exerted his energies not on verse, with its structured metering and formal constraints, but on prose, with its greater freedom of expression. What an apt and even prophetic appraisal. The Spectator, a periodical known for its coverage of current British affairs and culture, circulated a modest but encouraging poetry review. The critic begins with a line that sounds strained in its praise, stating that Dymer, if not so masterly, is perhaps better for its simplicity. Note that this reviewer begins with two subjunctive phrases. From a grammatical standpoint, you may recall that the subjunctive mood presents expressions of uncertainty or even doubt, in this case revealed by the words if and perhaps. Yet the critic does proceed with a somewhat more affirming, even reassuring tone in describing the poem. Here is the evolution towards spiritual freedom of a young man bred in the standardized society of the perfect city. Mr. Hamilton objectifies his theme so effectively and dramatically that it is not until the moving events are all done that we realize the full purport of what we have been reading. Here is a little epic burnt out of vital experience and given to us through the poet's eye. Again, pay attention to the suggestion that the reader may not truly understand the thematic significance of this little epic until after all of the plot action has completed. This is an odd way to say, reader, you should press on through this poem, tedious as it is, at which point you may be able to make sense of it when you're done. Why? The poem does not readily disclose its meaning, canto by canto. The critic closes with something that at first seems complimentary, calling Dymer a lovely poem. The choice of diction here could not be further from reality. To be clear, William Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 is a lovely poem. John Keats's Ode to a Grecian Urn is a lovely poem. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning's How Do I Love Thee is a lovely poem. But C.S. Lewis's Dymer is not. It defies the category of lovely. Rather, this verse narrative, written by a poet in his 20s while in the midst of a profound identity crisis, existential belief, struggle, all of the angst of a young man, it's all so dramatic, which I must confess the poem is not. It is certainly not readily accessible or aesthetically beautiful, especially for a reader who prefers lovely poems. A critic writing for the Poetry Review offered an assessment of Lewis's craft that was less effusive in providing a critical evaluation of Dymer, raising as many concerns about the poem's inadequacies. The reviewer states in reference to the poem, one is little impressed by the allegory that is hard to understand, amazed at the alternate flashes of brilliance and dullness of style, and wholly delighted by the lyrical quality of not all the lines. Note that each of the poem's strengths is linked to a related weakness. In the end, Dymer proves not to be a resounding success to this critic. One final review of the poem, published in the Saturday Review, a London newspaper of politics, literature, science, and art, employs the indicative mood of grammar, that of fact and certainty, to express the negative sentiments of the critic who pulls no punches. The critic expounds, "As for Dymer, the symbolism is to us not at all clear. Dymer was born in the perfect city, a horrible utopia from which he quite naturally revolted, but his revolt led to a revolution for which he felt himself severely to blame, though he had to merely run away after he says to himself, I must murder a lecturer." Here the critic pauses to offer a snarky parenthetical comment. "But then there have been many lecturers we have wanted to kill." The critic goes on, "He, Dymer, finds a remarkable palace, has an affair in a dark area with a beautiful girl, who afterwards turns out to be the spirit of truth or some such thing, meets up with an old gentleman who dabbles in black art and turns out not to be a gentleman after all, finds out the cheat of dreams, goes to a graveyard and translated into a super solar, where he meets an angel sentinel who says he is guarding the way of spirits from a beast of despair. This turns out to be Dymer's progeny by a lady aforementioned, so Dymer takes armaments from the sentinel, indulges in combat with the beast, is killed by it, and then the conquering brute becomes a winged, sordid shape, much like a god who towers to the skies." Huh? The critic concludes with me, "There the poem ends, but the poem as a whole does not gel. The mixture of realistic detail and wandering symbolism is not successful." Finally, the critic observes that the poem's phrasing is never extraordinary. In summation, the critic's concerns are these: the plot of the narrative poem lacks focus, meandering here and there. 2, the overall structure is flawed, never really holding together. 3, the symbolism is unsuccessful in its presentation without possessing semiotic lucidity. And 4, the word construction is nothing extraordinary and frankly quite ordinary throughout. These are not the remarkable traits of great literature, Professor Root. Nevertheless, they accurately convey some of the inherent complications with Dymer, problems that readers today will no doubt wrestle with. The tepid critical reception of Lewis's poem suggests that there are indeed serious flaws with the craft of Dymer. Returning to my central assertion, the poem is rather unremarkable, apart from the associated renown of its versifier. Informed by Aristotle's theoretical perspective, as found in the Poetics, something that Lewis would have been very familiar with, I see the major flaw of Dymer as being its incoherence, a disjointed collection of cantos with lots of murky thoughts, dark woods, and fantastic encounters with weird beings. First, consider the length and basic meter of the poem. 9 cantos, each comprised of about 30 stanzas, for a total of 295 septets of rhyme royal, a metrical form used by Jeffry Chaucer, which employs 7 lines, each containing 10 syllables, written in iambic pentameter with the rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, B, C, C. Obviously, this medieval meter was not vogue when Lewis chose it for his poem at the turn of the 20th century. As Lionel Addy explains, there was a diminishing public for this sort of poetry in the 1920s. Still, Lewis, by my count, places approximately 18,000 words. That's how many words I had to read for this talk. And over 2,000 lines of this archaic verse form. As Addy observes, Lewis therefore failed by poetry at a time when Eliot succeeded. Keep in mind also that Dymer is characterized as an epic, a long narrative poem. That indeed it is, recounting the adventures of a hero. Aristotle avers that an epic plot should naturally emerge out of the continuous action of the central character, resulting in an organic poetic structure, one possessing wholeness. He writes, a poetic imitation ought to be unified, but Dymer appears more disjointed than unified. As Alistair McGrath explains, the whole is somehow not equal to its parts. Its few shards of brilliance are not sustained and are overwhelmed by the expanses of lackluster flat lines. Dymer, considered as a poem, simply does not work. In Canto 1, the voice of the narrator poet describes the function of the poem. It is a social contract. We begin, the narrator says, a partnership where both must toil to hold the clue that I caught first. We lose or win together. If you read, you are enrolled. These initial lines suggest that to be a reader of this poem is to be enlisted. Think of that word, indeed, in the hard work of making sense of it. However, immediately the presumed partnership between writer and reader becomes strained because of the plot's asymmetrical development. A truncated beginning portrays Dymer committing a violent murder, an Aristotelian act of hamartia, all within the first 10 stanzas, well before the reader has time to acclimate to the setting, much less gain a sympathetic understanding of the protagonist, which I argue never happens. And so the plot unfolds in the meandering muddle of the middle of the poem. Dymer roams from the Platonic school of his slain teacher to the forest of sexual indulgence with a girl, to a palace defended by a gnarled old woman, actually the morphing spirit being of his lover. There's a Freudian interpretation waiting to happen. To a conversation about a revolution with a handless and footless man, to a moment of self-recrimination for a deed done impetuously, to a magician who tempts him to indulge in dreams for reenacted pleasure, to the unexpected moment of the maniac magician's gunshot and impending mortality, to the painful reckoning with his illusory ambitions and the self-indulgent self. The ending portrays Dymer in a great battle with a beast of his own making in the throes of death, fighting a monster. Like the Iliad's Hector, in this battle with Achilles outside the ramparts of Troy, Dymer throws his spear and misses, after which he raises his sword and shield for mortal combat. And at this point, I was so excited. I thought, finally, we are ready here to experience the purpose and drive of the poem. And at this point, the narrator poet surprisingly abruptly interrupts the action of the poem, much to the reader's chagrin, and states the following. What now, my friends? You get no more from me of Dymer. He goes out from us. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This deus ex machina moment jarringly disrupts the narrative flow of the poem. Such an epic aberration is, as Aristotle indicates, a departure from mimetic craft. The poet should do as little of the talking as possible, says Aristotle. As a result of this interruption, the reader feels cheated with regard to the original terms of the poetic contract established at the outset. The lasting overall impression of the poem's plot movement remains episodic and entangled. With all its formal intricacies, concludes Lucy Shaw regarding Dymer's organizational structure, it was unevenly conceived and executed. Finally, Lewis himself acknowledges his own ambivalence about the merit of Dymer in his 1950 preface to the second publication of the poem. There he confesses with astonishing self-effacement, much like a modern-day Augustine. Dymer, like many better books, found some good reviews and almost no readers. The idea of disturbing its repose in the grave now comes from the publishers, not me. Compare these mature reflections representing the Christian version of Lewis with the following pre-Christian reflections, which come from an entry in his personal diary right around the time that Dymer was first rejected by the first publisher. Note, it was rejected. There's a reason. The young aspiring poet writes to himself, "I desire that my value as a poet should be acknowledged by others. I have flattered myself with the idea of being among my own people when I was reading," referring to the great English poets here, "and it is unpleasing to have to stand down and take my place in the crowd. The only healthy or happy or eternal life is to look so steadily on the world that the representation of me fades away." What a profound realization from a man hungry to be accepted by the literati of his day. Yet this internal wrestling with his own demons of desire, channeled through his early attempt at self-made immortality through poetic success, greatly disappears thereafter. Shortly before his conversion, Lewis writes to his friend Arthur Greeves, consoling him after he had just gone through the disappointing experience of having his writing rejected. He explains to Greeves that throughout his entire early adult life, he had one single ambition, to become a poet, a great poet. This pursuit, he admits, took control of his thoughts and actions, becoming a form of idolatry until God supplanted it. Lewis explains how this idolatrous behavior began to diminish through the experiences of rejection and grief. The inability to get what he wanted, what he thought he needed, served as a strange sort of grace, tempering his heart and sharpening his mind for things that would later become the work of God. Writing to Greeves, Lewis in his early 30s describes the value of this unusual gift. "Suffering of the sort that you are now feeling is my special subject, my profession, my long suit, the thing I claim to be an expert in." Lewis consoled Greeves with genuine encouragement, drawn from his own experience of loss and struggle, affirming the possibility that his creator and Greeves' creator might somehow be at work treating them benevolently by preventing them from gaining renown in the realm of the great poets. As Don King perceptively writes, such a denial saved them from the disappointment and despair attendant upon those who briefly flame with literary fame, only to flicker quickly before fading into oblivion. As Professor Root has argued, Dymer demonstrates an early manifestation of the iconoclastic theme that captivated Lewis's imagination as found throughout the works of his mature Christian life. One can only wonder what would have resulted if Dymer had actually succeeded and had won the applause of critics. What if it had exhibited a coherent structure, and if it had become a great literary work, remarkable in its artistic craft? What we know, however, is that Lewis failed as a poet by his own candid assessment. His dream was dashed, and he experienced iconoclastic disillusionment. To this ironic conclusion, all lovers of Lewis should resoundingly say, "Thank God for Dymer."
As we get the room ready for a question and answer time with our two speakers, I want to remind you that Tim Larson will be available to sign copies of his book afterwards in the museum. And if you're unable to stay to get his signature tonight, he's also doing a book signing tomorrow at 2 in the museum. We also have bookmarks at the front desk, which contain the dates of the future lectures on Dymer. And we invite you to join us for a not very iconoclastic reception out in the foyer. This is made possible by Martha's Table, a grant named in honor of Clyde Kilby's wife, known for her gift of hospitality. So, if our two speakers could come up here, David will pass the mic if you have any questions. And please speak into the mic because this is, the recording comes through the mic.
I have to say at the outset, I came just for that response. Tim's got something, I think.
Thank you both. It was wonderful. I wonder if you both could talk a bit more about the choice of genre. I know that the Victorians loved book-length narrative poems, but as you've indicated, that's out of fashion or just about to go out of fashion, and the same with the Rhyme Scheme, and yet he's clearly ambitious to kind of make a mark with his generation. So I have two questions. One, are there other narrative poems that are book length happening at this time, or is he really kind of the last of that genre? And then what was he thinking in terms of the reception, given the choice of genre and the rhyme scheme, etc.?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there are other narrative poems being produced at that time. But I do know one thing in response to what Dr. Davis said about the use of allegory when he read that one critic who said allegory is a better way to express the interior life. Lewis himself agrees with that and says it in The Allegory of Love. But he also says the nature of myth is that a myth could be expressed in any literary genre. So the fact that he's picking a secondary epic as a means of telling the story says he's sensitive to literary form to portray his material. And that will follow Lewis all of his days. He writes science fiction for that reason. He even writes Surprised by Joy as literary biography because he's trying to do autobiographical apologetics. He writes fairy stories because he says, as I mentioned, sometimes fairy stories say best what needs to be said. So I think he's sensitive to it. But I don't know who else is doing this sort of thing. I want to make one other comment too. When Lewis wrote the Experiment in Criticism, he says there's two kinds of readers, those who receive literature and those who use literature. And you enter into the literature and you let something be done to you. You know, the art requires you to look and listen and receive. And I think I've entered into Lewis that way. Lewis says to create a receiver as a person who enjoys literature, he says sometimes comic books can do that. And he talks about his own sons. So I want you to know that I actually still like it, even having heard what you have to say. But I like comic books too, so maybe that's part of the deal. I don't know anything beyond that, though, Dr. Orson. Maybe.
I might say there are a lot of Victorian narrative poems, The Ring and the Book and Idylls of the King. And
yeah.
Lewis was a cultural conservative, so he thought these conventions still worked at a time when most poets didn't think they worked. Early in life, he didn't like Edith Sitwell. He thought she was a modernist. But then she wrote a book-length narrative poem, and he forgave her. Toward the end of his life, he appreciated her work.
Well, Professor Downing, when you say that, I read not only the books Lewis has written, I like to read the books he talks about. And I think, I was a PE major when I was in college. I think I'm probably the only PE major who's actually read and enjoyed The Ring and the Book. And Lewis pointed to it, and I love that book, and I love the Romance of the Rose, and so on. And I mean, I don't know. I don't think I'm always reading with the critical eye. Dr. Davis helps me. He is to my academic life what Ernest Shackleton was to the guys who were on the Endurance. So anyway.
Jeffrey.
So, you know, at this time you've got Pound, you've got Eliot doing all kinds of inventive things.
Yeah.
They're the vanguard. And Lewis is, as you said, a conservative with regard to his own aesthetic tastes. And I think this is the fatal step that he makes. Are there people writing narrative poems? Sure, there are different kinds of narrative poems, but he's writing an epic, right? And that's not the vogue approach of his time.
But what you said was very, very good, that what would have happened had it been a successful poem? That all of us have benefited by the fact that it was not, and it pushed him into prose. Nevertheless, I still think the discipline, the years he spent writing this poem, helped him learn the economy of words, learned how to write with certain depiction and so on. I still think, and cadence and meter and whatnot, and I think that benefits his prose.
Yeah, I can't help but attribute a kind of supernatural quality to his own account of how the poem came to him. He said it came to him fully formed, conceptually. He knew the narrative. From where it came, he wasn't sure. But he had this narrative in his head that had to find, so the narrative structure was in his head, the elements, but they had to find form in this rhyme royal, which is a real feat if you think about what he had to do. He's writing like Chaucer. That's amazing. But I think in terms of where did this story come from, and where was God in the mix, right? He attributes the fact that his failure moved him to a deepening faith, and I take him at his word. Yeah.
Well, the humility in the letter you quoted to Greaves, I think, is a positive thing.
Yeah.
It was a humility you often don't see in his earlier work, his earlier letters.
He continues in that same letter and says there's almost a sense of relief in failure. You can kind of lick your wounds and crawl back and go on with your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beginning of genuine humility, that letter he writes to Greaves about the failure of Dymer.
Yeah. He can maybe even start reading comic books.
So God's the great iconoclast because he says, Clive, you're not a poet.
I think you've both proven that somewhere out there right now is a really bad singer-songwriter who's the next C.S. Lewis. What a great back and forth this was tonight. I wonder, just a comment that this is like Carl Jung's Little Red Book, a better comparison. Because he's personifying things in his psyche, but that's another thing. What about Arthurian torso? I wonder, because Jerry Dr. Root, you've talked about that here, and that's where I learned of it. And there, the prose gift kicks in to help out a friend who hasn't got the message about modernism yet and is still trafficking in epic poems.
Yeah.
And that is actually the best part of that book, is Lewis's prose helping of the poor Charles Williams. So what do you think about that?
That's a really good point. And it certainly isn't an even, Williams' poetry is not even at all. But I think Lewis seeks to bail him out by his assessment of that poem by making available to the readers the theology of Charles Williams, which is scintillating. And I think that's the benefit. But it's an interesting observation, because Williams' poetry I would never go back to it for the enjoyment of it. I go back to it for the theology embedded in it. There's one next to you, Eddie.
Thank you very much, both of you. I enjoyed that too. I'm wondering, for the part in the book where Lewis describes the main character, kind of his thirst for water as pulling him out of the dream. It just it made me think about symbolism for how Christ was how him as living water kind of brings us back to reality. I'm wondering if you guys saw any symbolism when you were reading Dymer, or if I'm just reading into that too much.
I don't think that the symbolism's there. I don't think he was thinking anything about Christ as living water there. He does something like that in The Silver Chair, where Jill comes to Aslan and he's at the stream and she's dying of thirst, and he says, there is no other water, this is the only water. But I don't think this was anything to do with Lewis. It is interesting, though, that the magician has these quotes from Scripture. And if you read Lewis's letters, too, he was not ignorant of the Bible in his pre-Christian days. That's why he even advises students coming up to Oxford, whether they're Christian or not, he doesn't know. He says, if you don't have a knowledge of the Bible, get it before you come here. So I think that he saw this. And I think there was one time, Walter, you might have been there with us when we were at at the Orcas Island thing, and we were talking to Malcolm Guy and Scott Cairns. You know, what was it that you wanted your students to get? If they were going to leave with one thing from a course in poetry, what would you want them to get? And I remember Malcolm said that he wanted people to understand the musicality of poetry and to capture that. But Karen said, I want them to understand the imagery and the history of the imagery and how they developed over time. And like Lewis says, you can't understand medieval literature if you don't understand the Bible. And that was his area. And I think it's interesting that even the pre-Christian Lewis has the magician quoting scripture in a sense accurately, but then saying you can't get this in real life, you only can get it in dreams. It's interesting.
So in counting images, which I was doing a pretty careful analysis of the text, the two words that are most common in the poem that get repeated most often are dream and light. And the other thing that's interesting from a symbolic standpoint is this is the age, so Lewis acknowledges that he's reading Freud at this time. He's very critical of what's called a Christina dream, which comes out of Samuel Butler, a novel. And there's this discussion that's going on in the cross currents of his day about the role of fantasy and the imagination as it leads to a certain kind of self-fulfillment satisfaction. And even I was joking earlier, but Lewis has a letter to a man later on in his work where he recounts the dangers of fantasy with regard to one's personal sexual life and the ways in which we can actually delude ourselves to an unreality that leads to a temporal fulfillment that ultimately is robbing us of our very being. I think this is the concern of Dymer. He's trying to portray the danger of a fecund imagination that leads in directions that are not healthy. And so there's all kinds of semiotic construals all over the place.
And this is also, this will be part of the topic next time, what are the streams that fed this poem. And he is very explicit in his denouncing Freud and the new psychology that he said was going on at Oxford. Right. And the Christina dream is interesting. We'll talk about it next time. But it's not, the Christina dream is not a salacious sexual thing. The Christina dream is just the compliant woman. Christina is very compliant to her husband about all matters and choices that he makes, even in ones that are hurtful to his own family. And so I think it's more that he's playing that sort of thing out. That is not real because it doesn't accept the complexity of another person. It's not objective. And so then the fact that he carries it into the magician's dreams, he's blending these two things, the Freudian psychology and the Christina dream. But Christina dream is not itself anything that's related to salacious sexual activity.
So, thank you both for a very entertaining presentation. So, it was written in iambic pentameter. He'd read and studied Homer's dactylic hexameter and some of the other metered poems. What was the motivation for him writing this? Was it simply his desire to become a poet, or was it something more that he was trying to achieve greatness like this classics that he'd studied, or was it some sense of striving for immortality and eternity and a sort of a hunger for what might later become his faith? Can you tell, what is the motivation for writing?
This is my opinion. As Professor Davis mentioned, the story kind of came to him. And Lewis writes about this often. He even says, perhaps we cannot say anything more about the beginning of a story than it came. And so I think the story was percolating inside of him and it needed to be told. He also says that when these stories bubble up inside of an author, they look for a form that fits the telling of the story. I think he set out to do that. I think he liked to write. He started writing even as a child. It was a part of his life. His skills will develop over time like anybody as he hones the gifts and so on. So I think that that was his main motive. This other stuff, I think, it gets attached to that. I think he did think that he would be a great poet, and I think he did have these dreams and aspirations. And maybe he was a little bit arrogant about it. I mean, the way he treats T.S. Eliot shows you how arrogant he could be when he saw Eliot was coming on and taking away the possibility of people really liking the kind of poetry he would want to write. So I think he was upset about that, but I don't think that he set out to write it because he wanted to be famous. I think that was second. I think he set out to write it because the story was percolating inside of him. What do you think?
Yeah, I actually think he did want to be famous.
And that's why he set out to write it?
No, I think it's both. There's another aspect that comes through really clearly, and I think about this in my own gestation as somebody who moved into the study of English. Lewis was involved in a writers group at an early age, and that social exchange with Barfield, with Greaves and others really was a stimulus for, yeah, share this. Did you read this? What do you think? And they were egging him on. He had a gallery of fans who were saying, you really need to get this done. And they were giving criticism and encouragement to one another. So I think that should not be underestimated.
It wasn't good encouragement, though, if they let him publish it, right?
Well, that's another question. Like I said, the wounds of a friend.
You would never let me get away with something
Right,
like
no.
that.
In the 1920s, the poetry was also the prestige genre. So if you wanted to make it, you would make it as a poet, become someone like Tennyson or Yeats. So ironically, he talks about sweet desire and Sehnsucht in the 20s. It wasn't lust, it wasn't this or that, it was to become a famous poet. When you talk about if it become famous, he talks in another letter about when you do become famous and you achieve it, that's just one more object of false desire. Becoming a well-known author is just like those other false objects of desire that he chases in Pilgrim's Regress.
But when it's interesting, though, because in the afterword or preface to the Pilgrim's Regress, which is the first book he writes after he becomes a Christian, whichever one, sometimes it's said as an afterword, sometimes a preface, he talks about these 7 forms of romantic literature. And he talks about different kinds of longings in which Sehnsucht is part, but never once does he mention something about the kind of literature where a person would want to be famous. So that wasn't even on his radar screen, at least at the time when he wrote that particular book. So.
Thank you so much. This was intellectually engaging and spiritually edifying. So it was just a great evening.
And it was funny, too.
And funny. It was fun. So my question is about the kind of central thesis and how that relates to what comes before and after with Lewis. The kind of continuity and growth that you were talking about, which I love, that theme running through your talk. And thinking about Fantastes, as you were talking, I just kept thinking about Fantastes. It sounds like that story.
Yeah.
There's the marble lady, there's the woods, there's an old woman, there's a beast.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of recurring imagery.
And Cosmo dies.
And a death.
Cosmo dies.
Yeah, and but in that story, there's a kind of removal to fairyland as the period of growth. So you go to the fantastical place to grow.
Yeah.
In Lewis's later work, you go to the fantastical place to grow, right? But in this work, you go to the real place to grow. So I'm just wondering about that difference. If you could speak to that.
One of the things that does address the question of the kind of flipped approach to growth, fantasy versus reality, Lewis confides in the reader in the preface to the 1950 version of the poem that he was in a struggle against things that he realized were reactionary struggles that really were overreactions. And so in his attempt to kind of challenge the romantic ideal and the fantastic, he's acknowledging in that preface that he went too far, that what he should have done was mediate somewhere. And I think that's really a fascinating self-assessment of where he was in his own life.
I don't have anything to add. Sorry.
Can I add one anecdote?
Yes.
Before the talk, I told Jeffrey that I wasn't that impressed with Dymer. And he said, by the time I'm finished, you'll realize it's a literary masterpiece.
Thank you all for coming. Jerry will be in the museum along with Dr. Tim Larson to sign his book. So if you have more questions to ask him, please join them both there and also take advantage of Martha's Table. Thank you for coming this evening.